Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm building my first spacecraft. Well, my first real spacecraft. And by real, I mean a scale model of something that actually existed. What spacecraft could I possibly be talking about?
We can read the title and see the box, Herbert. We're not stupid.
I'm going to build this Dragon 72nd scale kit of the Apollo 13 lunar module and command module. You know, the one that had a problem? I think they made a movie about it. I did a what's in the box video for this a while ago, so if you want to have a look at the sprues and various doodads that are in the box, you can find a link to that video in the description. I'm pretty sure in that video I complained about not knowing where the decals should be placed and there being no guide for that, but it turns out I'm just a big dumb, and there's a marking guide on the back of the box, so that's nice. Anyway, go check out the what's in the box video. Okay, now that you're back, let's glue some bits of plastic together, starting with this cone-shaped boy. Do space nerds get all upset if you don't use the correct terminology? Well, buckle up, friendos. The first thing I do is glue the heat shield on. I would say that you don't actually need this unless you want the lower part to be visible, but the hole in the bottom of it will help line stuff up a bit later, so might as well put it on. It's not like it's some gargantuan task of immense difficulty, it's pretty simple. This little ring goes on top next, and you can see that there's a bunch of small holes for the guide pins. Those make this really easy to attach. This next bit is easy too, though it's kind of optional. If you're modelling the command module and lunar module connected, you'll want to use this part as I've done, and this is easy, so you shouldn't have any trouble with it. There is another optional set of parts, which will form a docking probe. This does involve more parts, so it's probably a tiny bit more fiddly, but it's probably not too hard. Obviously I haven't done that, so I guess you'll just have to imagine it as you watch me use the command module as a spinning top. It's not very good for this. Moving on, I add some handles. I'm assuming these are for when the astronauts are retrieved after splashdown. There's mounting holes for these, and they're pretty easy to get into place. You may find tweezers to be useful here. There are actually 5 handles, but this last one, which goes on the top here, is slightly different. It is installed in the same way, just don't mix it up with the other handles and you should be fine. Now I move on to the lower rockety cylindrical section of the model, the part in which a problem was had. In fact, the parts I'm gluing together here are the interior portions where said problem occurred. The interior wall part I glued on did seem to really want to flop out of place. I used one of the triangular-ish shaped floor bits, probably incorrect terminology there. It did help me see where the parts should sit, and then I set that aside to bond while I cleaned up those parts. Which I will say wasn't too much of a hassle with this kit, it only required relatively minor cleanup. Anyway, these inner bits did need some assembly. Half of this tank is moulded into the floor, bulkhead, the other half needs to be glued on, which is simple enough. These two, I assume also tanks, and not just random balls, required the lower halves to be glued on too. Those parts can then be inserted into the appropriate portion of the internal thing. There's some fairly obvious guides for this, and it's not too difficult to figure out where the bits should go. I wasn't totally sure about this bit, I don't know what those things are, or why they're open on the bottom, but I guess they're meant to be that way, because I didn't see anything in the instructions, or on the sprues, that might fill those holes. So I glue it into place. And there we have it. Problematic spacecraft innards. I guess it's not really much of an internal detail without the external parts, so those come next. I did find putting the outer hull bits together to be a little bit puzzling, and they do go together in a particular way. If you were to try and put the wrong sections next to each other, there would be gaps, and nobody wants that. I'm not really sure if I should have put both of those ring sections on just yet, but I did, and it worked anyway, so whatever. This step did involve a fair bit of guessing and test fitting, but in the end, most of the hull is together. I figured it might be sensible to leave off the section opposite the interior bit to help install that. It does have some semblance of keying in some places, but it did take a bit of nudging and guesswork to get the, I think, correct positioning. I used the mighty power of the glue god to convince the parts to stay where they are, and then we can just plop this panel into place to hide it all forever. Maybe not, but you could do that if you wanted. Perhaps you would like to represent Apollo 13 before the problem. Once that's in, I add the final pieces of the hull to the other side. RCS thrusters come next, and while these are simple to install, they do have a specific way around they should be attached. I did at first find it a little bit confusing as to which parts I should be using here. Looking at the instructions and sprues, I was a little bit confused by the fact that there was more than one B sprue, and those two B sprues had the same numbers on different parts. Not really ideal. There were also multiple different C and D sprues. I'm pretty sure I got it figured out correctly in the end though, and all of the thrusters were glued on, though they are incomplete. There's a few more nozzles that need to be installed, so that each thruster has 4 nozzles. The instructions tell us to glue these on before putting the entire thruster assembly onto the model, but I think it's much better to do it the way that I did. Install the main portion of the thrusters, and then the small nozzles. Next, there's a lid for the section of rocket we just built.
Are you sure that's called a lid, Herbert?
Sure, why not? This should just drop into place nice and easy, but it didn't, and it seems I've got that upper ring part in the wrong place. You can see the holes for the guide nubs on the lid part, and you can probably also see that one of them is obstructed by a wall, and the other one would have the pin hanging right down into the exposed internal area where the problem was. It's not really the worst thing in the world, and I resolved the issue by clipping away some of the guide pins. It is, of course, technically wrong, but you probably won't notice it once everything's all together. Here's another thing I did wrong. There should be a series of arm-like thingies in here, but because they won't be seen, I've not bothered installing them. If not installing parts that nobody will ever see bothers you, please direct your angry comments into the void. Onto the bottom of this section of the rocket, which hasn't been glued into place yet, I add 2 of these doodads. I then glue that, I guess it's probably a heat shield, onto the bottom of the rocket stage. It did take a bit of fiddling, nudging and pressure to get it lined up, well, not perfectly, but as neatly as I could get it. A little bit of putty and maybe some sanding might be in order for these areas before painting, but it also looks okay as is. Why not add a nice little engine bell to the bottom of that assembly? This goes very nice and neatly into place, so not much to say about it, I guess. I then glue the capsule onto the top of the rockety cylinder duva. There's keying in the center of these parts to help get them lined up nice and neatly, so your capsule isn't sitting at a weird angle or something like that. I make sure there's plenty of glue, so the glue god will smile upon my bonds, and my space vessel will stay together. Then I add this thing. I guess it's to hold the 2 pieces of spacecraft together. Whatever it is, there's no keying for it, but there are a couple of outlines on the model that you can also see in the instructions, so that's where you glue this whatever it is. The shape of the part naturally wants to sit in the right place vertically, so that does help with positioning. Now, we get to some of the more fiddly details. This 2-piece thingy is part of a communication array of some sort. The 2 parts clip together and they should stay together without glue. I didn't want it flopping around at random though, so I glued it together. Then, these photo etch dishes are attached to these mount things. They've got a thin thing that pokes in through the center of the dish, and it's meant to sit with the sort of flattened edge of the dish, facing toward where the other dishes will be. This was a lot more fiddly than it looks. Definitely a lot more fiddly than I was expecting. I kind of regret saying in the build stream that I was sure the photo etch would be nice and quick and simple. I guess at least I didn't have to do any bending, so in that regard it was quite simple, but it was still a bit annoying. Anyway, I end up with a pair of antenna dishes on their mounts, which can then be glued onto the pole thingy I just put together before. It's a little bit fiddly because these assemblies are kind of delicate, but it does go together and it does look really nice. Now to start building the lander. I figured assembling the main body before adding the detail parts was a good idea. Less risk of breaking parts that way. The main chunks, or I guess you might call it the habitable portion of the lander, or the ascent module. The important thing is that it goes together nice and easily. The keying is good and helpful, and the result is pretty neat. There are some minor gaps here and there, but I don't think those will be too much of a problem. You can have some gaps in a spacecraft, right? Once the central chunk is all together, it's time to add the round door end, and that goes on just as easily as the other parts thanks to the big pieces of keying. You might find applying a little bit of pressure here will help minimize the gaps. I would suggest giving that a whirl. There's another chunk that goes on the other end, which consists of 2 pieces. I figured it was probably a good idea to glue those 2 together and then install them onto the lander. Again, pressure was helpful here. It's much easier and less stressful to apply pressure when you don't have to worry about accidentally obliterating tiny bits of detail with your mighty pressing power. The lander needs thrusters too. These are a little different to the previous thrusters, but the installation is very similar. The first 2 go on here like this, and like the previous thrusters, I add the 2 other nozzles after the main part has been installed on the lander. Simple enough. Instead of adding those other thrusters, I figured I'd left the communication array thing to bond for long enough that it wasn't just going to fall apart if I tried to install it, so I installed it, and it didn't fall apart. Hooray! Also, it does look rather nice. It does mean that you've got to handle the model a little bit more carefully though. I would imagine this part to be very easy to damage. Moving on, I add this little mounting for a communications dish, which will go on later. This is not difficult to install, though you may find you need to apply some pressure to keep the ends of the poles in contact with the hull. This antenna looking thing, maybe it's an antenna, goes on next. Initially I was a bit confused about how this should go on, my brain just couldn't decipher the instruction right away, but in the end I figured it out and it's not really that difficult. Next to that I install this little T-shaped thing. It's probably another antenna, or maybe it's a little handle so you can hold on while riding the outside of the spacecraft, as you do. I then add this little communications dish to the mounting thing I installed earlier. You can rotate the dish on the pole to be facing various directions, but I put it the same way that it's shown in the instructions because it just kind of looked right that way. I follow that with this mounting bracket which sort of slots into the top above the door here. This will be for another dish. It did seem like there was a different single-part dish and bracket combo on the sprue, but it wasn't mentioned in the instructions, so I put this on. How about some more thrusters? These are a bit different than the 2 I put on a few moments ago, in that they've got a sort of chunk that holds them up and away from the hull a bit. They're easy enough to install, and as with the previous thrusters, the other nozzles go on after I've got the main parts installed, but I chose not to do that right now. Instead, I added this thing. I don't know what it is, but it goes here. Next comes this bar, which I'm assuming is structural. It's got keying, so it only goes on one particular way. It is kind of hard to see in the video, but when you're holding the part, it's fairly obvious which way around it goes. I follow this with the dish that goes above the door. It comes as 2 parts. A mount with what I'm assuming is a counterweight, which is held between the 2 brackety bits with friction, and onto that I glue the dish itself. It's shaped such that it should be pretty hard to get this wrong. You could leave this to flop around freely if you wanted, but I've chosen to glue it into place. It's what the glue god would want. At this point I figured it would be fun and nice to add the nozzles onto the 2 sets of thrusters that don't have them. This is just as easy as the previous times I've done this, which is to say it is quite easy. Another antenna goes here. We did already add another one like this on the other side, and again I had a tiny bit of trouble grokking the orientation of it, but I got there eventually. On the bottom I add this engine nozzle. I assume this is the one that would launch this portion of the lander back up into space. This is keyed, so it goes into place with no issue. Now it's time to build the lower portion of the lander, the bit that would have stayed on the moon, had it actually gone to the moon. I glue the 2 halves of this main body thing together, and I'm not totally sure I should have done that at this point, but I did, and it worked, so maybe it's not the worst way to go. Anyway, the thing all the cool kids are doing is installing the landing legs, or landing gear, or whatever you would want to call it, so that's what I do too. I wouldn't say this is difficult, but it is a bit fiddly. There is keying, or I guess more realistically there's hints of keying. It's not perfect, and the poor keying is probably a result of the foily insulation texture. It could be better, but it could also be worse. The first thing is these little bar things that go on the bottom. I then add these V-shaped bits, which sort of connect with the parts protruding from the top part. These are very technical descriptions, I know, but you can see what I'm doing. I follow that with this main long leg part, the part the foot will be attached to. This was, as I said, kind of fiddly, and the parts don't seem to have gone together 100% properly, so it does look a bit messy. I think these parts of the model will require a little bit of putty to make it look like it's all consistent and covered in the insulation, rather than a sort of gappy looking mess. Next, I add the engine nozzle to the bottom of the lander. This, in the instructions at least, looks like it's meant to have keying, but it doesn't really. The part does still go into place, there's just a fair bit of play to it. I follow that by gluing this, whatever it is, into place. I think it should sit a little bit lower than what I've got it, with no gap along the bottom of it, but it wouldn't go on any further, so that's where it is. Next, I assemble 4 things. I've no idea what they're called, but they're little shieldy things with mounting frames. I think they could be for deflecting thruster thrust. Either way, they go together nice and easily thanks to the keying. You can see here that I've got the majority of the leg doodadery in place, and well, it doesn't look super neat, but that's okay. It's in place and that's the main thing. I then glue the feet on. There is keying here, but it's a bit poor, like I mentioned earlier. Still, I did manage to get the feet on in what looks to be at least close enough to the correct position. Now seemed like the right time to assemble this ramp thing. This is a simple matter of gluing the hand railings onto the sides. The guide holes make this nice and easy. Then, I finished the landing gear mechanism by adding these small parts, which kind of look like bones. I found these to be a bit fiddly to install, and tweezers were kind of helpful. I'm not an expert on the Apollo missions, or anything, but I'm not sure these leggy bits should really look like this. I feel like the foil covering, whatever its technical name is, should probably cover the joints a bit more, so those gaps shouldn't really be there. I could be wrong, this could be hyper-realistic, and I wouldn't know. If the gaps do need to go away though, it wouldn't be too hard to eliminate them with some putty. I glue those little shieldy things on next, and the gaps around the mounting holes for these may need a little bit of putty too. They were easy enough to install though. The ramp goes on next into this little slot, and it seems like this could be folded up or down. I felt like up was probably the most appropriate position for this. I test fit with the upper section of the lander just to make sure that it all goes together, and it seems like it will. We could glue these 2 assemblies together now, but I chose not to. I feel like it'll make things easier to paint if they're not glued together. That does make it a little bit harder to show as a completed model here at the end of the video, but I did my best with it. The model does come with a stand, but I'll have to show you how that goes together in about 400 years when I paint this. Anyway, the 72nd scale Apollo 13 Houston, we've had a problem kit from Dragon is completed. I'm pretty happy with this. I think it looks really good. I'm obviously not an expert on space, so I couldn't point out any inaccuracies in the model or anything like that, but I do find space very interesting, so this model is very appealing for me, and I think I'll do more similar models in the future. It's a nice change from tanks and the like. As the kids say, variety is the spice of life, and I do like spice. As a model, I think it's pretty good. Most of the parts went together well without hassle. There was, of course, some mold line removal, but that's to be expected. Though I will say there was a little bit more cleanup required for the legs, and that's kind of the opposite of what I was expecting, but it wasn't anything too horrible. As I've said a couple of times now, a little bit of work might need to be done on the lower portions of the model before painting, and while I'm doing that, I might choose to fill a couple of the other very tiny gaps elsewhere, though I wouldn't say there's anything major to do. I would have liked the instructions to be a little bit, well, more. I mean, they were adequate, and I did get the model built, but they're just kind of, well, they're not super in-depth. I just would have liked a bit more detail and information in some places. There were a couple of times I was a little bit confused on the orientation of particular parts, but nothing too serious, so it is only a minor complaint. Another minor complaint I have is that there were multiple sprues with the same letter and conflicting numbers. Most of the time it was obvious which parts were needed, but it did still cause a little bit of confusion here and there. Not enough to prevent the model from being built, but it was a thing. Having said that, it was a fun and satisfying build, so I would recommend it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you've built one of these, or any other cool models, space-related or any other kind, and you'd want to share, why not drop by our friendly Discord community and share some pictures? We'd love to see what you've done. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this one live on stream, head on over to my Twitch channel. And while you're clicking stuff, you may as well click the subscribe button here on YouTube, and why not ring the bell while you're at it? And maybe, if you have the means, and you want to help a Herbert Erpaderp do Herbert Erpaderp things, as well as see my videos a bit early before there's any ads, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to Patreon, and all of my other things like Discord and social media, in the description below. And, as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, have an amazing day, and thanks for watching. Farewell.